Vinyl community. Elliot here, Lazy Dogs Records. And today we're going back in time. We're going to step back about 100 years to 1925 and talk about the vinyl community at that point in history. Before we do, we'll backtrack just a little bit and kind of take some notes to get ourselves, adjusted in time. Now, if you think about it, 120 or 30 years ago, nobody really knew what they sounded like. They knew what it sounded like in their ears when they sang or played an instrument or something like that. But what they actually sounded like, it can be a very different thing. So it was a revelation for a lot of people when recorded music became a thing, and they actually heard themselves. I thought that's just interesting to take note of. Before we had recorded music, of course, we had sheet music, which sold very well, lyric sheets and the sheet music. People would, buy sheet music at the store and go home and play on their piano in the parlor or some other instrument that sheet music had been written for, marching band or something like that, or someone's playing some other instrument based totally on, just somebody, this person shows this other person something and they pick that up and they add it to something somebody else showed it and they show it to somebody else and they pick something up. So word of mouth or word of instrument, I guess you could say, and the oral tradition of folk songs passed down through time, of course. But by the late 1800s, we were beginning to get some recorded music. Around 1889, the phonograph record, both cylinders like this and the discs were beginning to appear. You could purchase, and they weren't cheap, but you could purchase a player and play music like this Edison gold molded records echo all over the world. Isn't that cool? And this was kind of the standard, or trying to be the standard, for about uh, 1889. And then by 1910, this was beat out by the flat disc record. But this is a cylinder. You place the cylinder on, put the needle down, and if I remember correctly, the needle stayed put and the cylinder moved across, and it would reproduce the sound. Thanks to my friend and fellow history lover, John Bethune, who gave me this and one other of these a while back. So Edison's problem was he was a little too greedy. He wanted to have a monopoly on the recordings, and he insisted that anybody who recorded for a cylinder could not record in any other format. And as a result, people that wanted to record often went the other route, the disc, which we would come to call 78s, the shellac 78s route. So this come along at about the same time, but by uh, 1910, 1912, this had become the standard, a 10-inch, what we call a 78. Although they really didn't use that term back early on, I don't think. Uh, they hadn't even really settled on 78 for a few years, but that averaged out to be about the speed uh, that these should be played at for normal sound, and that became the standard 78. Now, this isn't from that early a time. This is from 1947. This is an Ella Fitzgerald 78. Oh Lady Be Good from 1947. The records were made of shellac, very fragile, and during World War II, they had started developing the use of vinyl. The military had, and a year after this record came out, by 48, they were in the process of converting from the shellac to the vinyl. So that's another innovation. But we're going back 20 plus years to 1925 for the focus of this little video. Now, what did people play them on? Well, there were Victrolas and other companies that made phonograph records. Now, at first they were acoustical players, meaning you didn't have to have electricity uh, to play them. You had a crank and you uh, up, cranked it up, and it used spring action to turn the platter at the proper speed, and then it would go through the needle down the tone arm into a horn and come out the horn. Those acoustic and the recordings, the early recordings were acoustical as well. 1925 would mark a turning point in the recording industry, which I'll take note of. But first, here's a little about uh, something you would be playing your music on. If you were a member of the vinyl community in 1925, you might have this player. This is a phonograph player from 1925, started being put in the stores in the fall of 1925, made in Camden, New Jersey, from the Victor Company, Victrola, if you will. There were 4 models put out that year that were improvements on previous models, uh, better frequency response, better volume, and overall better tonality than what they had been putting out before. This is called the Colony model. The model below it is just a little bit smaller. This is about 9 inches wider, and it gives room in the cabinet for storage of records on either side of the horn. I'll show you that in just a second. And it is a mechanical, it's not electrical. Uh, they called them acoustic then, but today our terminology would probably be a mechanical model. It has a crank on the side here, which I do not have the crank for, and I'm eventually going to get this up and running. I've got located crank and a couple of other items to get it up and running. My daughter found this for me at a Goodwill in either Greenville or Kinston, North Carolina. I don't remember which, but it opens up, and as you can see in here, you've got your platter here, you've got your needles, and your tone arm here, and your stylus is a needle right here that is replaced every side you play. You discard that needle and put a new needle on to play the next side, or else you'll wear out your records. I'm sure a whole lot of records were worn out. Those uh, shellac 78s were worn out from people using the same needle over and over. And it just moves along like that. And as I say, it's the Colony model. This would have sold for about $110 back then, which would be the equivalent of about $2,000 today if you factor in inflation. Now, where does the sound come out? Well, what you've got to do is open the doors. So you have to have some space in your room to do this. And you've got storage space here and here. And all this is the horn, the speaker that the music is going to come through the tone arm out and through here. So it was a little bit bulky. You had to have a decent sized room. You're going to have your doors open when you're playing it, that sort of thing. But this is what someone, a record collector, a music lover in 1925 would have been listening to or listening to music with in all likelihood. Radio was just getting started, and there a couple of years before this, less than 1% of the people had in the country in the United States had radios. And it wouldn't be a majority of people in the United States with radios until about 5 years after this, by about 1930 or so. They started putting these in stores by Christmas season, 1925. But by the end of 1926, they had discontinued this model. By the mid part of the year or so, they quit making these. They didn't sell as well. If it was manufactured in 1925, this is open. The horn here is open, speaker, if you will. If it was manufactured in 1926, trying to increase sales, they put a cloth grill here to make it look a little better. And so on the 1926 models, you have the grill. Checking the serial number, this was definitely manufactured in 1925, not 1926, both because of the grill and one other upgrade they did. You had to crank this for each record you played, and that there were a lot of models that you could crank it and it would play several records before you had to recrank it. So they they improved this spring here so that you could crank it and get more plays before you had to recrank it uh, in the 26 model. So this one doesn't have that. So I'm looking forward to putting this back, getting this up and going in my own sweet retiree time, if you know what I mean. And that brings us to uh, how things were recorded. 1925 is an important year when it comes to that. They were called, the recording process was called acoustical recordings at that point. Uh, you had a horn, which there was no microphone, it was a horn, which had to be played into. And you were sending the sound through the horn, through a diaphragm, uh, into a needle or a stylus that was cutting a wax. When they when they cut it, they actually had a weight system. You would crank up uh, the system to turn the platter, to turn the lathe that would cut the wax. You'd crank it up to the top, and when the musicians were given the signal, you would release that weight, and that weight would gradually lower to the bottom, and that's what's turning the lathe. So it was mechanical; it wasn't electrical, and you got good recordings from this for their time, but there were a lot of limitations. The high and low frequencies weren't there. It was just kind of in the middle. Uh, you couldn't capture a lot of subtle instruments, subtle sounds. Uh, some sounds overwhelmed it. So you ended up getting more of a tinny sound or a much more narrow sound in the recording. And another problem was when you're cutting that wax, once you play it one time, you ruin the wax uh, and the wax disc. So you couldn't check what you were doing to see how it sounded, whether you needed to place the horn a little here, a little there, whether you know distance was in, distance was important from the horn, whether you needed to use a different horn, a larger horn, or you know all kinds of variations that you could make to change or improve the sound, but you couldn't do it on the fly. You could, but Western Electric and some other individual inventors were working on all kinds of electrical means of reproducing sound. And by 1925, they had come up with it. A lot of what they were using were things, for instance, because of the telephone, to be able to boost the signal for a telephone conversation from long distances, you needed amplification, and they were building amplifiers for the telephone. So they got to the point where you could call from the East Coast, call the West Coast, and you could be heard from that distance because of various means of amplification, electrical means of amplification. The tubes were invented, things like that. Uh, they invented a condenser microphone, and then you got eliminated the horns, and things were done electrical. The first racks that were used in recording, racks of amps and various other electronic devices used to enhance or improve or uh, maintain frequencies and things like that, were created at that point. 1925 is that turning point. Uh, they started making the transition uh, from, and they had the lathe that they were been using for the acoustical recordings. And now they would buy and usually lease because they were so expensive, the electrical uh, stylus and mechanisms, the microphone and the mechanisms to hook up to the lathe, to using electricity to develop and make those grooves in those wax discs, those flat discs. And so that was a major improvement because suddenly you have broadened the sounds that you can achieve through a record. You have, the highs and lows are there now. The microphones would continue to be improved upon, but that was just that first little condenser mic that they came up with was a huge breakthrough. And you could really hear the difference between uh, the acoustical or mechanical is really what they are, but the acoustical record that was being recorded and the electrical uh, means of recording. Now, in 1925, they were just getting started. I believe it was Columbia and Victor had agreed they weren't going to talk about this too much to begin with in 24, 25, because they had a lot of records to sell that were acoustical recordings. And they didn't want everybody to say, I don't want any more of those. I want the new stuff. And they would be sitting on all this stock. So they were hushed about it to begin with. And as they were depleting their stock of that, they were also building a stock of the electrical recordings. A huge breakthrough in music in 1925. And you can imagine if you were a music lover, if you were a member of the vinyl community 100 years ago, when you heard that first electrically recorded record, it had to have blown your mind. I mean, talk about some audiophile discussion. Just think of discussions that could be had on the Hoffman forums and live streams on YouTube uh, about the quality recordings that they were beginning to hear and which was better, who was doing a better job of recording, and so on and so forth. Maybe the most famous recording from 1925 would have been those made by Louis Armstrong and his Hot Five. time realm. Uh, Charlie Poole and his North Carolina Ramblers recorded in 1925 and had hit songs here. He's the first big superstar of what we would come to know as old time music.
Now I've been on around this whole wide world, down to Memphis, Tennessee. Any old place to hang my hat looks like home to me. Now I left my little gold clock standing in the door. So arms around my neck, saying, honey, don't you go. Now I've been on around this whole wide world, done most everything. I played cards with the king and the queen, discard the ace and the ten. Boys, don't let your deal go down.
And then there's the Empress of the Blues, Miss Bessie Smith.
I hate to see the evening sun go down. I hate to see the evening sun go down. It makes me think of on my last go round. Feeling tomorrow like I feel today. Feeling tomorrow like I feel today.
So there you go, a little bit of history about the year 1925. What would the vinyl community be doing 100 years ago this year? I think that gives us an idea. We've looked at some of the music we would have been listening to, how we would have been listening to it, and the major innovations that had occurred in that year. I hope everybody's doing well. And remember, folks, please be kind to your neighbors. Love your neighbor, and your life will be a better life.